you, I feel like a lion in the den of Daniels. But I'm going to risk it. I'd like to try to take time in front of us and sort of work our way through this process of preaching. In order to do it, I want to interact. If you decide you don't want to talk back to me, then we might as well all go home. That's too tempting, isn't it? I hope that you, as Christian people, will interact with me. But maybe in doing that, we can sort of enter into the process. Because it seems to me that in homiletics, the major question we're trying to answer is what does a person do with his thought, or what does a person do with her thought when they prepare to preach? Homiletics isn't 3 points in a poem. It's really... Thank you, Mother.
There you go. Encore.
I'll shoot you when I want a reaction. That's the trouble. You pay them to react and they earn their money.
Although it was American money.
Either that or monopoly money. But I'd like to interact with you and see if we can sort of enter into the process and maybe out of this get a glimpse in a relatively short time of what the process may be like. When you prepare to preach, or when you preach, what's the purpose of preaching? Why do we preach? I know you're out there. I can hear you breathing. Why do we preach? What do we intend to do? What?
Convey a message.
All right, convey a message. Let me push that a little further. Why do we convey the message? What are we trying to do when we convey it?
Change the world.
Yeah, change people, change lives. It's easy to forget that on a given Sunday morning. You often preach because you got to fill the time between 11:25 and 12 with something religious. But ultimately, the purpose of preaching is to change lives. Okay, now, if you're going to change lives, then let's move up. How do we think we're going to do that in the ministry of preaching? What do we do to change lives?
We really don't change lives. We provide the ambient that the Spirit of God can become alive within person.
Okay? So what we do is to present God's truth, and we trust that God, the Holy Spirit, will take that truth and in the truth entering into people's minds and lives, they will act upon it, so that we change life by presenting God's truth. Now, when you come to the business of preaching, what's the first decision that you've got to make if you're going to preach a sermon?
What's your text going to be?
Yeah, what your text is going to be. That may sound obvious, but there are a lot of folks who spend a great deal of time getting ready to start to begin to answer that question.
What's the subject?
What?
Or what's the subject?
All right. What do you want to preach about? What's the text? What's the subject? How do you decide what text you're going to use?
Needs of the people.
All right. One way you come at it is the needs of the people. What do folks need? And when you do that, you start with the need, and then you look for a passage of Scripture that you think will touch that need. Or sometimes you have an occasion. It's Christmas. Chances are you'll want to preach on the Incarnation. So you start with that situation, and then that directs you to something in the Bible, probably a passage in Matthew or Luke, that will speak to them. So one place you can start is to start with people's needs and go to the text. How else might you determine that? you're preaching through a book, then if you were in Galatians 3 this week and you finish Galatians 3, one thing you know is Galatians 4 can count. You may turn to Galatians 4 and not have the slightest notion what it means, but at least you have made a big decision. This is where I am. And now if you start with the passage, then your first task is to understand the passage, but then what you have to do is to ask the question, what need does this meet? Where does this touch life today? Where did it touch life in the first century, but where does it touch life today? So you either start with the passage or you start with the need. As I said this afternoon, the difficulty of continually starting with need is that often you run out of those needs. After a month or two, you've kind of exhausted the needs of the congregation. And then if you do get a red-hot need, you may not really be aware of where the Bible speaks to it. You sometimes discover that you come to a passage, you look at it, you're sure it's going to speak to the condition, and then as you study it, as a way of fooling you, it doesn't really talk about what you thought it talked about. And that means it's now Friday or Saturday night. Panic seizes you. So generally, as I was saying, I think if you do expository preaching, one of the benefits is that you usually go through a book or examining a topic, but you at least have decided what you're going to talk about. All right, let's suppose that you have worked your way through, and one way or another, you've come to a passage. I suppose you're going through Matthew, and you're in Matthew 18. That is, you were in Matthew 17 last week, or Matthew 18 this week. Now what kind of a question do you have to ask?
How much do you preach on?
Yeah, how much do you preach on? You can preach the whole chapter, half the chapter. What factors weigh on you when you're trying to decide that? That is, how much are you going to preach on this Sunday? What are the tensions that you have to deal with?
Natural breaks.
All right, natural breaks. Or to put it another way, the literary unit.
Context.
All right, the context, and that context will help you discover a unit of thought in the passage. If you're dealing with didactic literature, the literature of the letters of the New Testament, then the basic unit of thought is a paragraph. That is, by definition, what a paragraph is. It's a basic unit of thought. A sentence can be a paragraph, but a paragraph is usually more than a sentence. So a paragraph is a unit of thought. Or you may take two paragraphs, which make for a little larger unit of thought. But in the epistles, you are often looking at paragraphs, or a series of paragraphs, which form a literary unit, which get across an idea. If you are in other kinds of literature, for example, if you are in the literature of narrative, then the literary unit is usually the story. It may be an episode of the Joseph story, David's story, but it is usually the story. And you cannot very easily break up that literary unit. For example, if you're going to preach on the three bears, you really cannot preach on one Sunday that bears sat down to hot porridge, the glory of the hot church and the danger of hot porridge, or when Goldilocks comes and she falls asleep, you preach a sermon on a sleeping church, or the bears come back and you preach a sermon on the significance of bears and the visions of the Revelation. You really have to preach that as a single unit. No, it's not in the Bible. Yeah, the sermon for next Sunday. You do, by the way, just in passing. If you're preaching a book like Luke, you have 4 chapters in Luke. Each chapter, turns out, I think, is divided at the right place. They are like 4 scenes in a play. And it is possible to preach a series of sermons in Ruth. You might preach the first sermon on the whole book. If I understand Ruth, the idea behind it is that while God's providence is always at work, it is often hidden, but it is still at work. So as you work through the book, you just see that the people in the play, Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, are going through the motions, and the author, almost tongue-in-cheek, says, by chance this happened. The chance they came on the field. But he is well aware this wasn't by chance. But for them, it looked like chancy stuff. In fact, well, I don't think I'm going to Luke, but into Ruth, but you may preach that in sequence, but always it's sort of like a continued drama. And each of those chapters, in a way, reflects that broad theme of God's hidden providence active in the life of his people. That's a homiletical problem, but basically you have to understand that Ruth, the whole book of Ruth, is a literary unit. Or you have a parable, or you have the Revelation, apocalyptic literature. So one tension, one of the things you have to look at is what is the unit? The unit of thought that conveys the idea. What other tension works on you when you have to choose a passage?
How well do we understand it?
Yeah, that does help. How well do we understand it? But in choosing the passage, what other limitations do you feel?
It might be a particularly difficult passage in the sense that it confronts a particular sin or something that you might want naturally to edge away from.
Okay, yeah, there is the tension of avoiding passages. That's, you wish God had a visiting preacher next Sunday, like this one. Well, the tension that I have in mind is the amount of time you've got to preach. If they give you, 20 minutes, there's just some passages that can't be preached in 20 minutes. But between you and the congregation, there is a contract. That may not say much about it when you go there to candidate, but everybody in the congregation knows what the contract is. It may be time. They may give you 30, 35 minutes. More often, at least on a Sunday morning, it is probably a time on the clock. It doesn't matter when you start, but when it hits noon, everybody knows it's time to quit. I'm convinced in many churches, if you want to preach longer, it's better to try to get the service to start at 11:15 and go to 12 than it is to start at 11 and go to 12:15. I don't think I've ever known anyone who lost the church because he preached too short. I have known several who have lost their churches because they preached too long. All that is to say, that sounds very unspiritual, but the reality is there's a contract. And you get a certain amount of time to preach. And invariably, you wish you had 10 minutes more. The congregation wishing you took 10 minutes less. So you try to stop. All right, so you have those tensions. And they're there. They're working. And the purpose of all of this is that you want to try to change lives. Let me look at a passage with you. And let's take a look at it. I'd like you to look at Matthew chapter 18. So that we can have at least a segment of the passage in front of us, let's start at verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter will be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you the truth. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, And whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, I tell you, if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three come together in my name, there am I with them. Now, when you come to study a passage, what is it that you're looking for? What are you trying to do when you study a passage? What are you trying to determine? What it means, okay? I'll buy that. Trying to determine what it means. When you say that, looking for meaning, what are you looking for precisely? Yeah, the idea. Very good. Somebody's read my book. And when you are looking for an idea, then you've got to be able to identify it. Great mass of ideas by which people live and love and choose and die are subliminal. It is advertisers who know that what you do is to plant an idea and avoid the critical faculties and just lay it in. So advertising deals with ideas that are unexamined. If you look at ads for shaving lotion, the idea that comes across is that if you use this shaving lotion, it'll be irresistible to women. In fact, there's one shaving lotion, they give you instructions for karate chops to keep them off. If they delivered what they promised, no Christian that took the Bible seriously could use that kind of thing. I use shaving lotion. I tell you, it doesn't work. Or you get perfume. What are you wearing when you wear a perfume called Taboo? Or My Sin. You've never heard of a perfume called the Puritan Hang-Up. But the ad doesn't tell you that. It just sort of suggests it. What we do is we take in these ideas and they're not examined. But in order for us to understand and evaluate an idea, or for us to communicate, we have to be able to identify it. Great mass of people never bother with that. They just accept the ideas that come from radio, television, and printed page. Enough ideas there to damn them, send them to hell. Break up their homes, their lives. But, for instance, in advertising today, one of the things that advertisers know is that we are still touched by the Puritan ethic. So one of the things they want us to believe is that anything we get, we deserve. McDonald's says if you want a hamburger, you deserve a break today. Oh, the Buick ad, late at night, the man's still in the office, one light on, he turns it off, and he comes out to this darkened parking lot, and there's a brand new Buick. Says you worked hard, gotten to the top. This is your reward. Not that you buy a car to get from point A to point B. Buy a car to leave your neighbor in your exhaust fumes. This is, you deserve it. The danger of that is in a culture like that, ours, if you get everything because you deserve it, you'll never be thankful. You'll never understand grace. But that is planted in the mind to get you to move the merchandise. If you don't take that out and look at it sometime, you find that you come to believe that. So it's tough to be thankful if I deserved it. So the question is then, as we're going to look at an idea, what's it made up of? An idea has two parts to it. It has a subject which is the answer to the question, what is this person talking about? And it has a complement.
Can you write a little bigger? It won't help.
And the complement is the answer to the question, what is this person saying about what he's talking about? There was something in the complement. What is this person talking about? It is the complete, definite answer to that question. The subject in a sermon can never be a single word. In that sense, it differs from the subject grammatically in a sentence. It is always the complete, definite answer to the question, what am I talking about? Or what is this person talking about? The complement completes the subject. It's the answer to the question, what is this person saying about what he is talking about? Until you can answer those two questions, you don't understand a paragraph. You don't understand a story. You're not ready to preach a sermon. For example, if I say, what this country needs, is that an idea? What is it? This country needs. What is it? Okay, so it's a subject. When you say what this country needs, it's a subject. Now give me a complement that completes that subject. What this country needs is a good prime minister.
Miracle.
All right? It's a miracle to get a new prime minister. All right. Give me another one. What this country needs?
Clean air.
It's clean air. Okay. In each case, you have the subject and you complete it with a complement and you change the idea. If I say, the test of a person's character, that's not an idea. That's a subject. That's what I'm talking about. Give me a complement to complete that subject. What? Honesty. Test of a person's character is honesty. Test of a person's character is what she would do if she were absolutely certain nobody would ever find out. Test of a person's character, like the test of an oak, is how strong is he at the roots. Test of a person's character is how he or she stands up to adversity. You have the subject. Test of a person's character. That's what I'm talking about. The complement completes it. When I have a subject and a complement together, then I have the idea. There's nothing that I can lay before you that I think can be more important than understanding the power of those two questions. They're not gimmicks, they're not gadgets, they really form the organic structure of thought. Whenever I read a book, whenever I watch a movie, whenever I plan a sermon, always those two questions. What am I talking about? And the subject is the complete, definite answer to that question. And the complement is the assertion or assertions I make about that subject. So when you're studying the Bible, when you're planning the sermon, that's the question that you have to ask. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 18. When you look at the passage that I read just a moment ago, verses 15 through 20, what verse in that section is probably the best known verse, or the one that would stand out for being most used? Yeah, verse 20. Where 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them. Now, if you just took that verse as though it were a unit of thought, when we use that verse, what is the subject of that verse, as the way it is popularly used?
Prayer.
All right, prayer. But it cannot be a single word. It has to be more than that. It has to be the complete, definite answer to the question. So when people are using that verse, you're in the ballpark but not up the home plate. What is the subject?
Presence.
What?
Presence.
Presence.
The fellow behind me, whoever it is, said presence of Christ. That's implied.
Oh, okay. The presence of Christ is implied. I would suggest that the subject, as it's normally used, is the power of the small group prayer meeting. And the complement is, the power of a small group prayer meeting is that Christ is there. The verse is usually used on a rainy winter's night when you and the janitor or your wife show up. So you say, well, it's just 2 or 3 of us, but the Scripture says, with 2 or 3 gathered together, Christ is here. So we can make a go of it. So it's the power of the small group prayer meeting. What is the power? Well, the power is that with 2 or 3 are gathered, Christ is here. That would be the compliment. Right, is that a unit of thought by itself? That verse. Does it stand by itself? Yes. I got. How many say yes? All right. How many say no? The no's have it. Not by number, but notice how it starts. It doesn't say 2 or 3 where 2 or 3 are gathered together. It says 4 where 2 or 3 are gathered together. So whenever you see a 4, you ask what it's there for. And it links you to the previous verse. Okay? It doesn't stand alone. So look at the previous verse. Again, I tell you that if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Now, you'll hear that verse quoted, okay, by itself. If it's quoted by itself, what do you think the subject is when it is quoted by itself? All right, agree. Can you spell out the subject?
Do you agree about what you asked for?
Okay, the results of agreement in prayer. And what are the results? Yeah, if you agree on earth, God will give it to you. So the result of agreeing in prayer is the subject. The complement is it will get an answer from God. If you have religious television here, like we have it in the States, quite often, going to pray for someone's hemorrhoids or whatever it is that's up there. How many of you will agree with me on this? Hands go up. No, we'll pray with you. Because we know we agree on anything on earth, we have it in heaven. That's right. The Baptists can't use this. But if they ever did, you do have problems with it, don't you? That is, there are times when you've got to go up against the Bible. You can't just lie down dead. Let's suppose that a couple of weeks ago, the Denver Broncos got together. On the Broncos, about 7 men, including the coach, who are Christians. So let's imagine that before the game out at Pasadena, they got together. And the Broncos, that's one thing they're sure of. They agree that the Broncos ought to win. And so they come together and in full agreement. No, even the pagans on the team would agree with this. They agree that God ought to give them the victory. The trouble is, on the other side of the wall, the Giants are there. And you will not believe this, but there are even Christians on the New York Giants. They didn't behave like Christians, but they get together. Let's, make it 7 over there, and that's it. They pray, and they're agreed that the Giants ought to win. You got agreement. Puts God in a kind of bind, doesn't it? I mean, a game is got to end up a tie. Then, get to thinking about it. People on the farm agree that it ought to rain. People in the church who are having a Sunday school picnic, believe it ought to stay dry. So the answer is, it won't rain on the church ground. It'll rain all around. Does that verse stand by itself, or those two verses? Are they a unit of thought?
No.
How do you know? God, again. You cannot have again unless you have something first. You go up and it says, I tell you the truth. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Okay, you take that verse. What do you think he's talking about? What do you think the subject is? What? Discipline. I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will make you so. Spiritual eyes see what the rest of us don't see. The way that is usually taken is how to bind Satan. The compliment is, if you bind Satan on earth, he'll be bound in heaven. That's the way it's often taken. I've had people come to me before a service say, Dr. Robinson, we've prayed that Satan will be bound. You could be free. I wish it were that easy. But that's often how it's taken. Okay. Now you've got something about how to bind Satan. Is that verse by itself? No. Okay, how do you know? Verily, truly, I tell you the truth. So it sort of takes you back to what goes before. So if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan. Well, you got to go up above. So you go to verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. Is that the beginning of a complete literary unit? Yes and no. If you have an American Standard Version, you have the word but. If you have a Greek text, you have a little preposition the. It's a mild adversative. It's not really but. It's just kind of and. The reason that the NIV is not included is because of a very interesting modern rule of style. And that is, if you have two paragraphs which are next to each other, it is assumed that those paragraphs are related to one another in meaning, unless the author gives you a clear indication that he is changing the subject. That's important enough to say a second time. In modern style, if two paragraphs appear next to each other, it is assumed that they are related to each other in meaning, unless the author gives you a clear indication that he is changing his subject. I prefer, as a study Bible, the New American Standard, simply because they put in a little the but. But that means that whenever you get two paragraphs next to each other, you've got to ask, how do they relate? And it's just assumed that they relate. So, in that case, there is a relationship. You have to look at the context. You will find more wisdom in the context of a passage than in the details of the passage. If you cannot explain how the previous paragraph, the following paragraph relate to the paragraph or paragraphs you're studying, you probably don't understand the paragraph. Now, in exegesis courses, we do get into the details because you have to teach that. But it can be misleading. There's more wisdom in the flow of thought, in the context of thought, than in the details of thought. So, if you look at the previous paragraph, it says, what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 in the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? If he finds it, I tell you the truth. He's happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. Will that stand by itself? Why? What?
He's using an example. What do you think?
Also, he is talking about the little ones. And you ask, who are the little ones? And if you go up above, say verse 2, he called the little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. By the way, who are the little ones? All right, the defenseless, those who trust. Not necessarily children. That might be there by implication, but it would be the new believers, the weak believers, the ones who come and simply trust. And if you look at the passage, Jesus says, you harm one of those, you're in big trouble. All I'm showing you here is that even though we may take a passage, and this is a subunit, it is related to what surrounds it. So that if you were to think of the Bible as an outline, and you have a Roman numeral, and then you have an A, and then you have a 1, and then you have a little a, and then you have a 2, and then an A and a B. That often what you are doing is all of these are ideas, by the way. It's a larger idea supported by 2 sub-ideas. This A is supported by these ideas. This A supports the 1. This A and B supports the 2. All of those are ideas. Now, this can be a literary unit. That is, you, on a given Sunday, take it out to look at it closely. But you must understand that it is related to a larger context. You just cannot lift it out without asking the questions, where does it fit? So even though we talk about a literary unit, we are not talking about a literary unit that is complete and separate from what surrounds it. What surrounds it informs the unit. Having said that, then let's look at the passage that I read, because it is a sub-unit related to what surrounds it. If you look at verses 15 through 17, and you're going to try to state the subject of that paragraph, what would it be? Beginning at verse 15. What do you think he's talking about?
Reconciliation with brothers.
All right, reconciliation is a single word.
How to exhort a fallen brother.
All right, how to exhort a fallen brother. Anybody else want to take a shot at it?
What to do when a brother sins against you.
All right, what to do with a brother who sins against you. Either of those would be worthwhile. Let's take how to, or what to do. How to restore? No, you didn't say restore. Exhort. Let me use the word restore. I think that may be.
I wouldn't argue.
Yeah, that's good. Wise man, hasn't gotten his degree yet. How to restore a sinning brother. When I am looking at a paragraph, one of the things I do is to try to say, what's the subject? And I will put one down, test it out, see if it works. I've got to somehow ask, what's this talking about? So I think this is a good way to begin. All right, if you're going to answer that from this paragraph, what you would have at least is some steps. So what's the first thing you do to restore a sinning brother?
Go.
All right, go. Go what? But go personally. Go alone. First thing you do is go to him alone. It says, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. What's your purpose in going?
To win your brother over.
Yeah, to win your brother over. Or you go to restore him. Okay. Why might you go to your brother when he has sinned or has sinned against you? And by the way, there's a textual variant there, which I don't want to get into, but let's take it as it's on the NIV. Why might you go if your brother sins against you?
He's weaker than you are.
All right, he's weaker, and what do you want from him when he's weaker?
Bring him up to your level of strength.
Oh, okay, so in that sense you would restore him. But what might you do instead of restoring? What other reasons might you have? Well, you guys are all
Vent
saints.
your anger.
here.
Vent your anger.
Yeah, vent your anger. You may go to him to get an apology. No, you've insulted him. I want an apology. Well, that's great stuff, but that's not what Jesus taught. He says if you go, the purpose is to win him. The purpose is to restore him. If you were going to illustrate the attitude that you should have when you go to restore a brother who has sinned, what kind of an illustration might you have?
I'm wondering in the NIV in that, where it says, and show him his fault, that perhaps the brother is unaware of the problem.
Yes, he may be unaware in the sense that he really doesn't know that he has sinned, or as often happens when we sin, we are often blind to our sin in the sense that we don't really think it's that important.
So it could be a matter of information at that first meeting as well as restoration.
Right. We might restore him by showing him into sin. We might restore him by showing him what his actions have done.
Applying the Word of God to his life
Right.
at that point.
But if you're going to try to demonstrate the attitude by which you should go, what would it be? How would you do it? Give me an illustration of it.
Oh, Nathan is Nathan.
All right, that's jumping back to 2 Samuel, which isn't bad, but why don't you stay in the text?
A shepherd looking for a lost man.
Shepherd looking for a lost man. You see, up above when Jesus says, what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 in the hills and go look for the one that wandered off? If he finds it, I tell you the truth, he's happier about that one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. In this context, I'm convinced that Jesus is not using that about evangelism. Over in Luke 15, he uses the same illustration to talk about winning those who are lost in the sense that they are not saved. But here he's talking about a sheep that has wandered off. God's concerned about it. When a shepherd goes after a sheep and he finds it, doesn't kick it in the stomach. He doesn't slit its throat. He puts it on his shoulders. He brings it back. He restores it. So the attitude that we have is that of a shepherd restoring a sheep. Delighted to be able to bring it back to the fold. I suppose that doesn't work. Suppose you go, your attitude is to restore it. And by the way, often people say the subject of this is church discipline. Only in the broadest sense. The real subject, as you said, is how to exhort, how to restore a brother who's sinned. This idea of, we need a backdoor revival, get rid of half of the sinners in this church. It's not what Jesus taught. Okay? What's the second step? That first one doesn't work.
Get somebody else.
Okay? Get one or two others and go to him. Now, what is the purpose of going to him with one or two others?
So it's not just your opinion.
Okay? You need somebody else. You need to take somebody else along, and you want to be sure it's not your opinion. And then again, what is your purpose when you go? To restore. Don't lose that. It dominates the passage. Where did Jesus get this stuff about one or two?
Witnesses?
Yeah, where did he get that?
Old Testament.
To where?
Deuteronomy 19.
That's great. You read the footnotes. It says Deuteronomy 19. You can either be a great Old Testament scholar or just read. Now, generally, you are wiser to stay in you're always wise to stay in the passage, to understand what the passage means. Some folks who like to play biblical hopscotch So they're over in James reading about faith and works, and they say, now what is faith? Well, Hebrews said that faith is the, What you've got to remember is that when the Bible was first written, those letters circulated by themselves. So that when somebody who read the book of James, you'd say, hey, we got another letter of Romans, let's bring that in. If you want to know what James means, read James. Stay with James. If you want to read Matthew and understand what Matthew means, stay within Matthew. Now, why is it all right to go back to Deuteronomy and take a look at this passage? Because the Lord is using that. Okay, so he is quoting from that, so that takes you back. So you look at the passage. Verse 15 of Matthew 19. One witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse a man of a crime, the 2 men involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priests and the judges who were in office at the time. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against his brother, then do to him as he intended to do to his brother. You must purge the evil from among you. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Interesting just to study that passage and see how Jesus takes the principle from the Old Testament to bring to bear on this matter of restoration. But reading that passage, what would be the characteristics of a witness that you might bring?
Credibility.
All right, credibility, honesty, integrity. That he is going to come and be open-minded. Looking at that passage, before whom does this judgment take place? All right, God and who else? The judges, the leaders of the people. You'll find that's interesting when we get back into Matthew 18. If you take some witnesses with you, 1 or 2, they look at the situation, what might they discover? Yeah, your role. If they are honest people, they may discover your role, that you just got hang-ups, that you're really a weak brother, and you're laying it on a stronger brother at this point because you've got a sensitive conscience. So they may discover that. And that matter would be settled. He really hasn't sinned against you. You think he has, but he has the fault you thought was a moral fault is not. That can happen. A lot of other things you could find in the Deuteronomy passage, but going back to Matthew 18, he has given us the second step. Okay, suppose that doesn't work. Suppose he says, no, forget it. Then what do you do? What's the next step? All right, you take it to the church. By the way, do you see in the first 2 steps a principle emerging? Go to him alone. By the way, if I think something is bad enough to offend me, then it's serious enough to confront alone. I don't go to somebody else and say, you think I ought to go and confront him? I go by myself. Then I take 1, maybe 2 with me. You see a principle emerging. What? Privacy? Yeah, privacy. I would say the principle is keep it as limited as possible. In the context, he's concerned about how sin will affect these young believers. You want to be careful that in dealing with this poison, you don't let it spread through the system. Keep it as limited as possible. All right, now he says, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. Right? When he says tell it to the church, whom might, if you were going to draw an inference, whom in the church might you take it to? First?
Church members. Leadership.
I think you take it to the leadership first. Why would you derive that as a principle, as a possibility? All right, the principle of Deuteronomy, it's before the judges. And also, if the principle is valid that we keep it as limited as possible, then I want to take it to the leaders of the church before I take it to the whole congregation. Now, that's an implication. You always have to decide whether it's a necessary implication or a possible implication. I would say if the principle we're following is a valid principle, then it would be a necessary implication. I would want to take it to the leaders. If that doesn't work, obviously, then I will, at some time, have to take it to the congregation. What's the fourth step? By the way, why do you take it to the church? What do you want to accomplish? You want to restore it. That's still there. Now, what's the fourth step? You what?
You fail, then you treat him like a tax collector.
All right, you treat him like a pagan or a Gentile or a tax collector. Who were the pagans? They were Gentiles. And from a Jewish perspective, who were the Gentiles? Yeah, they were outsiders. Right, they were outsiders. Who were the tax collectors? Yeah, they were traders. They sold their country. The Jews were convinced that they were snitches for Rome. So they were traders. Jesus says, treat him as you would a Gentile. You're saying you treat him as somebody who is outside the covenant relationship, outside the family relationship. We treat him like a tax collector. You treat him as someone who has betrayed this trust. When he says that, what do you think he means in terms of your behavior towards that person? By the way, why do you treat him as a Gentile and a tax collector? To restore him. Don't lose that. The fourth step isn't, now that you've gone through the first three, you can kick him in the stomach. You still want to restore him. Yeah. What is the relationship that you would have to people like this? All right, you try to win them. If you look at Matthew, chapter 9, chapter 11, when Jesus found tax collectors, and Matthew, by the way, was one of them. What he did was he treated them as outsiders, understood that, but he tried to win them. In the Corinthian letter, when Paul says, with such a one know not to eat, I'm convinced that in that circle he is talking about the love feast that they enjoyed together on a Sunday evening. He was not to be invited to that. Yeah? He's not talking about scheduling lunch with this person. So you treat him as an outsider. That is, if someone goes to you and with good motive to restore you, goes alone, brings, if that doesn't work, brings with him someone that you would agree to. Seems to me that would be part of an adequate witness, someone that we would both accept. And you don't accept that. You take it to the leaders of the church, and they deal with it. You don't accept that. Then that is de facto evidence that the person doesn't know God. Okay, what kind of claims he makes? It's de facto evidence that he doesn't know God. And so you treat him as an unbeliever. That somebody outside the family relationship, you treat him as someone who has betrayed the very essence of what it is to belong to a forgiven and forgiving fellowship. Okay?
Excuse me.
Right. Yeah.
In terms of the storytelling motif that Jesus is using here, do we need to consider what the concept of Gentile meant to the hearers of the story?
Sure.
Because the prevailing Jewish attitude was not one of winning Gentiles.
Yes.
So they didn't want anything to do with it.
But he is, you notice at the beginning of the chapter, talking to his disciples who have been with him through the book of Matthew, who would have seen this as Jews, but would have seen it also in the context of Jesus' life and ministry. So in that sense, Matthew would have heard this as one of the disciples, as someone who had not only come to know the Lord, but brought some of his scrubby friends in. So it is directed to the disciples who have been with Jesus, and not just to a Jewish audience. So I would say, in that sense, they would hear it with overtones of how Christ treated them. That would be my argument in terms of the broad context.
Would that be the same disciples who wanted to rain fire down the Samaritans for not letting this happen?
Oh yeah, they were a tough bunch. You know, they often missed the point, didn't get it, but
I was going to say that, I mean, you might rule this out as you did, but certainly in Mark's presentation, Jesus didn't want to have anything to do with the Syrophoenician woman. Just don't, you know, don't give the children food to dogs.
I think
Maybe that's not a...
I think in that context he was making another point
Okay.
in a different way.
All right, fair enough.
All right,
Isn't part of what behind what you're saying, though, that Jesus tried to show a way through deception by discernment, judgment as discernment rather than judgment as criticism in a critical sense?
yes, condemnation, is that what you mean?
And that so often judgment is seen, the Jews saw the law as the way to the kingdom, and we have, through history, had it away as though the law will come upon you or punish you with something.
And also in this, in the context, if the dominant motif is that you do this to restore them, then it becomes a very severe thing to be treated as an outsider. In that here is somebody who has professed to be one of them, if your brother sins against you, but now the evidence from what he has done in response to this entreaty may demonstrate that there is no reality. There may be reality, but from your perspective, you're treating it as an outsider. All right, going back to the homiletics of it, the subject was how to restore a sinning brother. But now you come to the next verse, next verses, and these verses don't quite fit that subject. Okay? There is more to the passage. So, but let's look at these verses before we see if we can come to another subject. He says, I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Actually, that's a future passage. It should be translated, I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Now, what do you think the binding and the loosing, which is probably a proverbial phrase, but what do you think it refers to?
Doesn't it refer to what is permitted or allowed?
Okay.
Speaking of Matthew 16, where I think these same terms are used.
Yes, when Jesus talks to Peter.
Yes.
And so, say that again just so we have it.
What is permitted or allowed?
Yeah, what is permitted
Good verse.
or allowed, or what is not permitted and not allowed. So in the context here, what do you think Jesus is referring to?
The actions to be taken?
Yes.
Caring of his brother?
Right. If you were going to press the proverbial expression, who would be loosed? Who would be bound? Yeah, the sinning brother would be loosed. That is, he would be put outside the fellowship. The one who would be restored would be bound. Can't press it because I think it is much more of a proverbial expression, but it means to approve, to disapprove, to set free, to keep in it. But in the context, he's saying whatever you do will simply be a confirmation of what has already been done in heaven. You're acting as the agent of heaven. Next verse says, again, I tell you that if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. Where did he pick up this two of you?
The witnesses.
Yeah, the witnesses. Up above, and the witnesses in Deuteronomy. Okay. For where two or three come together in my name, there am I with them. The two or three refers to the witnesses. You see, if you see this in its context, Jesus is not introducing, in verse 16, verses on prayer. He is still talking about the ministry of restoration. And you can tell that if you look at verse 31, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus said, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. 7 times 70. Now, notice that Peter doesn't come to the Lord and say, those are wonderful prayer promises. Next time we have a bad service on a Wednesday night, I'll have something to go on. Peter's response is still in the area of forgiveness. The brother who has sinned, if he is restored, must be forgiven. So Peter is still dealing with this whole area of restoration. The context tells you that the subject is not prayer. By the way, if you are in the Greek text at all, you'll find that there's some interesting words here that are worth a word study. You always have to decide what study is it, words to study. But where he says, I tell you the truth, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. Again, I tell you, if 2 of you on earth agree about anything you ask for. That word agree is found again in Matthew chapter 20, verse 2. And there it says, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire men to work in the vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard. Martin Gingrich says that, based on the context, that the word usually refers to agreement in a financial matter, such as a wage or a price dispute. Now, when people talk about agreeing, that is, if we agree about this matter, then God will do it, what do they usually mean by the word agree? What synonym would you use?
Want.
What?
Want.
Yeah, want.
A common purpose.
Yeah, have a common purpose. Unanimity is what is there.
Contract.
And the word for unanimity in the Greek would be the word homonia, like our word harmony. It's not the word that's used here. Not saying if 6 of you are in harmony. He is talking about the agreement that will come in a dispute. Okay. The word anything we have in the Greek, we have in the English. The word in the Greek is pragmator. And so the word shouldn't be translated, at least it's deceiving when we translate it anything. Because usually what we mean by that is any old thing. Anything. But it is any pragmatos, any matter, any issue. See, so it's not just anything, it's any matter. So any 2 of you agree about any matter. The word for ask comes from ateo, and it's an aorist subjunctive. And Martin Gingrich says it can, of course, mean to ask, but usually means demand. In this case, the formal demand of a witness. So, if 2 or 3 come together in my name, there am I with them. If you want to translate this more directly, you might translate it, if 2 individuals arrive at an agreement on earth concerning any claim they may be pursuing that's in dispute, it will be ratified on the part of the Father who is in heaven. So here he is saying that if the witnesses and the person who has sinned come to an agreement, what has happened on earth is already settled in heaven. If they don't, witnesses agree, the person who disagrees what they do in terms of making him an outsider to the fellowship is ratified in heaven. When you look at that, then the question is, what is the subject of the passage? What subject can we get to deal with this whole passage? We had originally how to restore a sinning brother. Can you see a subject that might be used for the whole passage?
How to have a healthy church.
How to have a healthy church. I think the subject would probably be why we should restore a sinning brother correctly. And the complement would be when we restore a brother, or a sinning brother, we act in the place of the Father and in the presence of Christ. Let me show you how this works out into an outline.
Could you see that again?
Well, I'll put it up for you, but we're going to hand this out so that everybody has a copy.
Are you saying that you can't apply those words to principle prayer?
Excuse me, I didn't hear your question.
Are you saying that you cannot apply these verses to the principle of prayer?
No, I don't believe they're talking about prayer at all. I know how you feel.
Is it on a principle of faith?
I think you'd do better to find the principle in some other place where it's more, where the subject is more clearly one dealing with prayer. Because in this case, it seems to me, it is very much circumscribed.
Another question, sir. One other word study on trespass, because some problems are not worthy of the process.
That's right. I think the problem, I think you would have to say in the context that the fault that you see would be something that would endanger the church, because he is talking about, or endanger these little ones. So it is, it would be, and it's something, I suppose, deep enough to bother you, so that you will go to confront the brother.
What do you do with the argument the church is not even accepting yet?
Well, I think, first of all, a major thing to say is that when Matthew was written, it was written long after the death of Christ and the resurrection. So you ask, to whom was Matthew writing? And the answer was very clear. He was writing to the church. He isn't simply writing to give them a detailed account of what happened before the cross. He is writing for them to understand the ministry of Christ. So I would say the writer and the readers were both at that time in the church, and that's where it was. What I want you to see is the way I would develop, in the light of what we were doing, an outline from this. The subject, the necessity of restoring a sinning brother correctly. The complement, when we act in a ministry of restoration, we act, and I think I would say, in the presence of the Father, in the presence of, in the place of the Father, in the presence of Jesus Christ. If I'm going to add to it, to establish the idea, you simply put those two together. We must restore a sinning brother correctly, since we act in the place of the Father and in the presence of Jesus Christ. Now, it's, I think, very important to establish subject and complement before you state the idea. The process of getting it is better served by doing that. And I see in the passage two major points. When we act in restoring a sinning brother, we should keep the matter as limited as possible. If that is the principle, then we see what that means. And there are 4 steps. We should go to the brother alone to win him. Secondly, we should take 1 or 2 witnesses with us to win him. The witness should take the matter to the church, and I suppose I should have added to win him. And the sinning brother who refuses restoration must then be regarded as an outsider, tax collector, and a Gentile. Okay. Under that is some of the supporting material we're looking at. The second major point, to elaborate on that idea, the first takes the sinning brother, what it means to restore a sinning brother correctly. But that raises a transition. Why do you have to take those steps? Why do you have to have the right attitude? Because when we act in the restoring of a sinning brother, we must take it seriously because we act in the presence of God the Father and of Jesus Christ. Under that, what the church does on earth as it follows this process ratifies what's already taken place in heaven. That is, we are carrying out what God has already said. And secondly, God the Father and the Son involve themselves by their authority and presence in this process. In that, you have the outline as it would come out of this study. Just a couple of things about outlines that may be worth saying. I think you've got a better outline if each sentence of each point is stated as a complete sentence. Points have a way of getting away from you like a greased pig. If you have a single word, you discover that you have not really pinned down the point. So I have found that full sentence outlines help you to see the flow of thought. When you can see the flow of thought, once you see it, you are able to explain it. If you're simply dabbling with words, you find that much more difficult. One other thing I need to say is obviously I chose this passage for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it has a lot of exegetical booby-traps in it. There are several verses here that are often quoted out of context, and they are quoted for good reason. As I was saying about Spurgeon, priests write sermons from bad texts. I'm not against prayer. I think prayer is a good idea. I just don't think this passage is teaching. Second thing you'll often find is if you will stay with the passage and work it through, it often says things more shocking than what you would normally have said if you were dealing with platitudes. I did it in an hour and 20 minutes. I knew where I was going. If you're sitting there thinking, man, I didn't get that, you will take more time at it than we have done. I was trying to move you through the process. You have to work your way through the process. But it is basically that process that you follow as you're working with the content to derive the thought from the passage so that you don't impose thought on the passage. You are trying to let that passage be exposed in expository preaching to speak for itself. There are things you will now do with this exegetical idea and outline to make it into a sermon. And the night, not tomorrow night, but the night following, I'd like to work on that with you. So to say, how do you take any passage and preach it so that it gets to listeners' attention? Well, the honorarium gives you 10 more minutes to ask me questions, so